A wealthy man buys a child as a gift. The transaction is legal, documented, witnessed, but when the girl arrives at the plantation house, something in her face makes the household servants fall silent. Something in the shape of her eyes, the curve of her mouth. The baron's wife faints at the sight. His daughter screams because the child standing in the entrance hall barefoot and shivering looks exactly like the baron himself looked as a child. A resemblance so precise it cannot be coincidence. The family Bible holds secrets written in margins. The ledgers contain names that were supposed to stay buried. And in a locked room on the 3rd floor, there are letters that explain everything. Before we continue with the story of the Harrove family and the child who destroyed them, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss the dark stories we uncover every week. And tell us in the comments, what state are you watching from? We love knowing where our audience is listening from. The transaction occurred on March 14, 1857, in the commercial district of Charleston, South Carolina. The morning had begun with fog rolling in from the harbor, thick and gray, carrying the smell of salt and fish and the distant sound of ship bells. Baron Wilhelm Harrove, a title he purchased during a trip to Bavaria 15 years prior, along with a spurious coat of arms and a fabricated lineage, entered the auction house on Meeting Street with a specific purpose. His daughter, Constance, would turn 16 in 2 weeks, and he'd promised her something extraordinary. The Baron was 53 years old, though he looked older. Years of rich food and expensive wine had thickened his waist and reamed his face. His hair, once dark and thick, had thinned to wisps of gray that he combed carefully across his scalp each morning. But his eyes remained sharp, the eyes of a man who'd built a fortune through calculation and ruthlessness. That fortune derived from rice plantations along the Ashley River, 3,000 acres worked by 200 enslaved people, and shrewd investments in railroad expansion. Textile mills and Charleston real estate. He'd married late at 40 to Margaret Whitfield, daughter of a Virginia tobacco dynasty. It had been a strategic alliance joining his new money to her old name. Margaret was 38 now, still beautiful in a cold, brittle way. With pale skin she protected obsessively from the sun, and hands that trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching. Their only child, Constance, had been born a year after the wedding after Margaret had suffered 2 miscarriages that left her unable to bear more children. Constance had been raised with every advantage wealth could provide. Tutors from Boston taught her literature, history, and French. A music master from Vienna gave her piano lessons 3 times a week. Her dresses came from Paris, her jewelry from London, her books from New York. She'd never set foot in the slave quarters, never seen the rice fields where the family fortune was made, never touched anything coarser than silk, or eaten anything that hadn't been prepared by someone else's hands. She was beautiful in the way of porcelain dolls, pale, perfect, fragile. Her hair was the color of honey, her eyes a clear, cold blue. She had her mother's delicate features and her father's strong will, a combination that made her both charming and dangerous. What she wanted, she got, and what she wanted for her 16th birthday was a girl her own age to serve as her personal attendant. Not one of the field hands, she told her father, wrinkling her nose in distaste. They're too dark, too rough. I want someone pretty, someone who can read and write, someone who knows how to dress hair and speak properly, like a companion, but one who has to do what I say. The Baron had understood immediately. His daughter wanted a slave who could pass for a friend in public but would remain property and private. It was a common enough arrangement among wealthy families, a way to display both affluence and benevolence. Look how well we treat our servants. Look how educated and refined they are. Look how much they love us. The auction house was crowded that morning. Planters from the surrounding counties had come to replenish their labor force after a particularly harsh winter. An outbreak of pneumonia had swept through the slave quarters of several plantations, killing dozens. Others had been sold to pay debts or divided among heirs after deaths. The auction house did steady business in human flesh, and Thaddeus Crane, the auctioneer, had grown wealthy from his 10% commission. Crane was a small man with a large voice, dressed in a black suit that was slightly too tight across the shoulders. He had the smooth manner of a professional salesman, able to describe even the most wretched specimen in glowing terms. Strong back, good teeth, no history of running. The words rolled off his tongue like poetry, transforming people into livestock, souls into inventory. The Baron had specific requirements which he'd communicated to Crane the previous week. The girl had to be young, between 14 and 16. She had to be light-skinned enough to work inside the house without causing comment among visiting families. She had to be literate, or at least capable of learning quickly, because Constance wanted someone who could read to her, write her correspondence, and manage her wardrobe. And she had to be pretty because Constance couldn't bear to look at anything ugly. I understand completely, Crane had said, making notes in his ledger. I'll see what I can find. Girls like that are rare, you understand? Educated, attractive, light-skinned, they command premium prices. Price is not a concern, the Baron had replied. Quality is. Now standing in the auction house with tobacco smoke burning his eyes and the smell of unwashed bodies thick in the air, the Baron was beginning to regret his confidence. 17 girls had been presented so far, and none met his standards. Too dark, too old, too sullen, too scarred. One had been pretty enough, but when Crane ordered her to read from her Bible, she'd stumbled over simple words, clearly illiterate despite the auctioneer's claims. The Baron was about to leave, frustrated and annoyed at the wasted morning, when Crane hurried over, his face flushed with excitement. Baron Harrove, a moment, please. I have one more girl, just arrived late last night. I think she might be exactly what you're looking for. I've seen 17 girls already, Crane. What makes this one different? She came from an estate sale in Georgia. Previous owner was a school teacher's widow, recently deceased. The girl was raised in the house, educated alongside the woman's own children, can read, write, and cipher. 14 years old, light complexion, good health. The estate needed to liquidate assets quickly to pay debts, so the price is actually quite reasonable. The Baron's interest was piqued despite his frustration. Bring her out. Crane disappeared into the back room and returned a moment later with the girl. The Baron's first thought was that she was too thin. Her dress, of faded calico that had been mended multiple times with mismatched thread, hung loose on her frame, suggesting she'd lost weight recently. Her feet were bare, the soles hardened and cracked from walking on rough ground. Her hair, a mass of dark curls that caught the light in shades of brown and bronze, had been tied back with a piece of string. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and she kept her eyes fixed on the floor, the posture of someone who'd learned to make herself invisible. But her face made him pause. She had large dark eyes set wide apart beneath straight dark brows, a straight nose neither too large nor too small, perfectly proportioned, a mouth that was perhaps too generous for classical beauty, but striking nonetheless, with a full lower lip that suggested both sensuality and stubbornness. And her skin was the color of honey in sunlight, pale enough to pass in certain circles, ambiguous enough to raise questions in others. There was something aristocratic in the bone structure, something that suggested breeding despite her circumstances. What's your name? The Baron asked. Eliza, sir. Her voice was soft but clear, educated. No trace of the Gula accent common among coastal slaves. No hint of the Fieldins' rough speech. She spoke like a lady's maid, like someone who'd been trained to serve in refined households. Look at me. She raised her eyes slowly, reluctantly. They were remarkable eyes, dark and intelligent, with long lashes that cast shadows on her cheeks. There was weariness there, and something else, a kind of resigned dignity, as if she understood exactly what was happening and had already calculated her chances of survival. The Baron felt an odd sensation in his chest, something he couldn't quite identify. Recognition impossible. He'd never seen this girl before, and yet there was something familiar about her features, something that tugged at the edges of memory. Can you read? Yes, sir. And write and cipher? Mrs. Brennan taught me. Mrs. Brennan was your previous owner? Yes, sir. She was a schoolteacher before she married. She taught her own children at home, and she let me learn alongside them. She said it was a sin to keep anyone in ignorance even. She stopped abruptly as if realizing she'd said too much. Even slaves, the Baron finished. Yes, sir. And this Mrs. Brennan, she passed away recently. 6 weeks ago, sir. Consumption. Her son inherited the property, but he lives in Savannah and didn't want to maintain the household. He sold everything, the house, the furniture, the land, and she paused, swallowing hard. And us? How many of you were there? 7, sir. I was the last to be sold. The Baron walked around her slowly, the way he might inspect a piece of furniture or a horse. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze fixed on the middle distance. She'd learned clearly how to endure this kind of scrutiny, how to separate her mind from her body, how to survive the humiliation of being examined like livestock. He noticed details as he circled her. The way her dress, though faded and mended, was clean and carefully pressed. The way her hair, though simply dressed, was neatly arranged. The way she held herself with a kind of quiet dignity despite her circumstances. This was a girl who'd been raised with some care, some education, some sense of her own worth, which would make her both more useful and more dangerous. How much? The Baron asked Crane. For this one, $800. She's educated, healthy, no history of running or disobedience. The estate provided documentation of her good character. That's a fair price, Baron. You won't find better. It was actually quite high for a girl her age. Field hands sold for $400 to $600, and even skilled craftsmen rarely commanded more than $1,000. But the Baron didn't haggle. He wanted to return home, present his daughter with her gift, and be done with the unpleasant business of slave markets. The smell of the place was making him nauseous, and the sounds, the crying of children, the pleading of mothers, the cold efficiency of Crane's voice as he catalogued human beings like merchandise were beginning to disturb him in ways he didn't want to examine. He paid in cash, counting out $800 in banknotes while Crane prepared the bill of sale. The document was simple, legally binding, and utterly routine. Received of Wilhelm Harrove, the sum of $800 for one Negro girl named Eliza, aged 14 years, sound in body and mind, warranted against the vices and maladies prescribed by law. This 14th day of March 1857, Crane signed with a flourish, added his seal, and handed the document to the Baron. She's yours, sir. I'll have my wife clean her up and provide proper clothing. She'll be delivered to your residence this evening. See that she arrives before dinner, the Baron said. My daughter is eager to meet her. He left the auction house without looking back at the girl, without seeing the way her hands tightened briefly before relaxing again, without noticing the single tear that slid down her cheek before she wiped it away with the back of her hand. The Baron walked the 6 blocks to his home, a 3-story mansion built in the Georgian style with a walled garden and a view of the harbor. The house had been built in 1803 by a rice planter who died in a duel, and the Baron had purchased it 15 years ago when he'd first arrived in Charleston with his new fortune and his new title. He'd spent a small fortune renovating it. New wallpaper from France, new furniture from England, new chandeliers from Italy. It was a showplace designed to impress visitors and establish his position in Charleston society. Margaret was in the morning room when he arrived, working on her embroidery. She looked up as he entered, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "Did you find something suitable?" she asked. "I did." A girl from Georgia, 14 years old, educated, light-skinned, exactly what Constance requested. Margaret's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "What's her name?" "Eliza. She'll arrive this evening, and her background. She was owned by a schoolteacher's widow who recently died. The estate sold her to pay debts." Margaret set down her embroidery and folded her hands in her lap. "Wilhelm, we need to discuss this." "Discuss what? This gift for Constance? I'm not sure it's appropriate." The Baron frowned. They'd already had this conversation, and he thought the matter was settled. "You agreed to it 2 weeks ago." "I know, but I've been thinking about it and I'm concerned. Constance is young, impressionable. Having a slave her own age, someone she might come to see as a friend, it could give her the wrong ideas about the natural order of things." "The natural order of things," the Baron repeated. "You mean the fact that we own people?" Margaret's face hardened. "Don't be crude, Wilhelm. You know what I mean. Constance needs to understand her position in society, and that means understanding the difference between herself and those who serve her. If she becomes too familiar with this girl, too attached, it could cause problems. Or it could teach her how to manage a household," the Baron countered. "She'll be married in a few years, running her own home, supervising her own servants. This is good practice." "Practice?" Margaret said softly. "Is that what we're calling it?" The Baron didn't answer. He poured himself a glass of brandy from the decanter on the sideboard and stood looking out the window at the garden where roses were beginning to bloom. He was thinking about the girl, about the way she'd looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes. There had been something in that look, something that made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite define. "She'll be fine," he said finally. "Constance will be delighted, and the girl will be well treated. What more do you want?" Margaret picked up her embroidery again, her needle moving in quick, angry stitches. "I want you to remember that she's property, Wilhelm, not a person, not a friend, not a member of this family. Property, and if you forget that, if Constance forgets that, we'll all pay the price." The Baron drained his glass and left the room without responding. He went to his study, locked the door, and sat at his desk, staring at the bill of sale. $800 for a human being. $800 for a girl who could read and write and think and feel. $800 for someone's daughter, someone's child, someone's whole world. He'd made hundreds of such purchases over the years, thousands if you counted all the slaves he'd bought for his plantations. But this one felt different somehow. This one felt personal. He couldn't have said why. The girl arrived at the Harrove house at 7 o'clock that evening just as the sun was setting over the harbor. The sky was stray with orange and purple, and the air had cooled slightly, bringing relief from the day's heat. Mrs. Crane had done her work well. Eliza had been bathed, her hair had been properly dressed in a neat bun at the nape of her neck, and she wore a simple but clean gray dress with a white collar and cuffs. She looked like a lady's maid, respectable and presentable. Thomas, the head butler, opened the door. He was a tall, dignified man in his 50s with gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent his entire life in service to wealthy families. He'd been with the Harroves for 10 years, and he ran the household with quiet efficiency. "You must be Eliza," he said, his voice neutral. "Come in. The family is in the parlor." He led her through the entrance hall, and Eliza had a brief impression of wealth and elegance. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, oil paintings and gilt frames, furniture that gleamed with polish. It was a different world from the modest house where she'd lived with Mrs. Brennan, and infinitely different from the slave quarters where she'd been born. The parlor was on the first floor, a large room with high ceilings and tall windows that looked out onto the garden. The walls were papered in pale blue silk, and the furniture was upholstered in cream and gold. A fire burned in the marble fireplace, even though the evening was warm, because Margaret Hargrove believed that a proper parlor always had a fire. Constance was sitting at the piano when Thomas brought Eliza into the room. She'd been playing a Chopin nocturne, one of the melancholy ones that she'd been practicing for weeks. Her fingers moved over the keys with practiced ease, though her mind was clearly elsewhere. She was thinking about her birthday, about the gift her father had promised, about the new servant who would be hers and hers alone. When Thomas cleared his throat, she stopped mid-phrase and turned on the piano bench. Her eyes widened when she saw Eliza. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, Papa, she's perfect." She stood and crossed the room quickly, her silk skirts rustling. She walked around Eliza the way her father had done that morning, examining her from every angle. Eliza stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes lowered. "Look how pretty she is," Constance said, reaching out to touch Eliza's hair. "And her skin is so light she could almost pass for white, couldn't she? If you didn't know, you might think she was just a poor relation or something." "Constance," Margaret said sharply, "don't touch her like that. It's not proper." "But she's mine, isn't she? Papa said she's my birthday present. She's your servant, not a doll. There's a difference." Constance pouted but stepped back. "What's your name?" she asked. "Eliza." "Eliza Miss." "Eliza what?" "Just Eliza Miss." "Well, that won't do. You need a proper name. I'll call you Eliza Gray because of your dress. Do you like that?" "Yes, miss." "Thank you, miss. Can you really read and write?" "Papa said you could." "Yes, miss. Say something in French." Eliza hesitated. Mrs. Brennan had taught her some French, but she was far from fluent. "J'appelle Liza," she said carefully on Chante d'Irvatrescence. Constance clapped her hands in delight. "Oh, that's wonderful. We can practice French together and you can help me with my correspondence and read to me when I'm bored." And she stopped suddenly, her smile fading. She was looking at Eliza's face, really looking at it for the first time, and something in the girl's features had caught her attention. The shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw, the way the light fell across her cheekbones. "Papa," she said slowly, "doesn't she look like someone we know?" Margaret Hargrove, who'd been sitting by the fire with her embroidery, looked up sharply. Her eyes went to Eliza's face, and for a long moment she simply stared. Then, very slowly, she set down her embroidery hoop. Her hands were shaking. "Wilhelm," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you get her?" The Baron, who'd been standing by the window with a glass of brandy, turned to look at his wife. "I told you. The auction house on Meeting Street. Why is something wrong?" Margaret didn't answer. She was staring at Eliza with an expression that was difficult to read. Shock, certainly, but also something that looked like recognition and fear. "Look at her face, Wilhelm. Really? Look at her." He did. And for the first time, he saw what his wife had seen immediately, what Constance had sensed without understanding. The girl's features, the wide-set eyes, the straight nose, the shape of her jaw, the curve of her mouth were familiar. Disturbingly familiar. He'd seen that face before in old daguerreotypes and portraits that hung in his study in the mirror when he was young. It was his own face, or rather the face he'd had as a child before age and excess had thickened his features and coarsened his skin. The resemblance was impossible to ignore once noticed. It was as if someone had taken his childhood portrait and rendered it in female form with darker skin and softer features, but unmistakably his bloodline. The Baron felt the room tilt slightly. He sat down his glass carefully, afraid he might drop it. "What's your name?" Margaret asked, her voice shaking. "Your full name?" "Ela, ma'am." "Just Eliza." "What was your mother's name?" The girl hesitated. She'd been trained not to speak unless spoken to, not to volunteer information, not to cause trouble, but something in Margaret's tone demanded an answer. "My mother's name was Sarah, ma'am." "Sarah Brennan." Margaret made a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She stood abruptly, swaying slightly, and Thomas rushed forward to steady her. "I need to lie down," she said. "Wilhelm, I need to speak with you privately now." The Baron was confused, his mind racing to make connections that he didn't want to make. "Margaret, what?" Now, Wilhelm Constance, who'd been watching the exchange with growing bewilderment, stepped forward. "Mama, what's wrong? Why are you upset?" "Nothing, darling. I just have a headache." "Thomas, take the girl upstairs to the spare room next to Constance's bedroom. We'll sort this out later." Thomas nodded and gestured for Eliza to follow him. As they left the parlor, Eliza glanced back once, and her eyes met the Baron's. In that brief moment, he saw something in her expression that made his blood run cold. She knew, somehow, impossibly, she knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. Her mother must have told her. Perhaps Sarah had described the man who'd fathered her child, the wealthy young Baron who'd used her and forgotten her. Perhaps she'd shown Eliza a sketch or a newspaper illustration. However she'd learned the truth, it was clear from her expression that she understood the situation completely, and she was waiting to see what he would do about it. In the master bedroom, Margaret collapsed into a chair and began to weep. The Baron had never seen his wife cry, not in 15 years of marriage. She was a woman of iron composure, trained from birth to maintain dignity under all circumstances. To see her like this, her face crumpling, her shoulders shaking, was profoundly disturbing. "Margaret, for God's sake, what's wrong? Who is Sarah Brennan? You don't remember her?" Margaret's voice was bitter, choked with tears. "Of course you don't. Why would you? She was just another girl you ruined." The Baron felt a cold sensation spreading through his chest. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. Think back, Wilhelm. 28 years ago, you were 25 years old, newly arrived in Charleston, trying to establish yourself in society. You were invited to a house party at the Brennan estate in Georgia. Do you remember?" He did vaguely. It had been a long time ago, before his marriage, before his fortune was fully established. He'd been young, ambitious, and not particularly careful about his behavior. The Brennan estate had been one of the largest in Georgia, and an invitation there had been a mark of social acceptance. He'd spent a weekend drinking, gambling, and trying to make connections with wealthy planters. "There was a girl there," Margaret continued, her voice steadier now, hardened by anger, "a house servant, very young, very pretty, light-skinned, the daughter of one of the Brennan slaves. And well, it was rumored that old Mr. Brennan himself was her father, though no one said it aloud. Her name was Sarah." The memory was coming back now, hazy and uncomfortable, like something glimpsed through dirty glass. There had been a girl. He'd been drunk most of that weekend, celebrating some business success he could no longer recall. There had been a late-night encounter in the garden, or perhaps in one of the outbuildings. He honestly couldn't remember the details. It had seemed inconsequential at the time, the sort of thing young men did without thinking about consequences. She'd been pretty and available, and he'd been drunk and careless. "You're saying that girl, Eliza, is the daughter of that Sarah?" "I'm saying she's your daughter, Wilhelm, your daughter by Sarah, which makes her Constance's half-sister, and the girl you just bought as a birthday present for your legitimate daughter is your own child." The Baron sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. The room seemed to be spinning slightly, and he felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the brandy he'd been drinking. "You can't know that for certain," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Look at her face. She looks exactly like you did at that age. I've seen the portraits in your study, Wilhelm. The resemblance is unmistakable, and the timing fits perfectly. If Sarah became pregnant that summer, the child would be 14 years old now, exactly Eliza's age." The Baron put his head in his hands. He was thinking about the girl, about the way she'd looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes, his daughter's eyes. "But how did you know about Sarah?" he asked finally. Margaret's laugh was harsh, brittle. Because I've always known about your past, Wilhelm. Before we married, my father had you investigated. He wanted to make sure there were no scandals that might embarrass the family. The investigator found several indiscretions, including your encounter with Sarah Brennan, but Sarah had been sold away from the Brennan estate shortly after that summer, and there was no evidence of a child, so my father decided it was an acceptable risk. He never imagined you'd be stupid enough to buy your own bastard daughter at auction. The Baron felt sick. He thought about all the times he'd congratulated himself on his business acumen, his social success, his careful management of his reputation, and now, with one careless purchase, he'd brought his greatest shame into his own home. Margaret, I didn't know. I swear to you, I had no idea. Of course you didn't. You never bothered to think about consequences, did you? You took what you wanted and moved on, never considering that your actions might create a human being who would someday stand in your parlor, looking at you with your own eyes. They sat in silence for a long moment. From somewhere in the house, they could hear Constance's voice, bright and cheerful, talking to Eliza. The Baron thought about his daughter, his legitimate daughter, and the gift he'd just given her, a sister she would never acknowledge, a blood relative she would treat as property. What do we do? He asked finally. Margaret's face was hard, her tears dried, her composure restored. We do nothing. We tell no one. Constance must never know. Society must never know. As far as anyone is concerned, Eliza is simply a slave girl you purchased at auction. Nothing more. But Margaret, there is no but, Wilhelm. Think about what would happen if the truth came out. The scandal would destroy us. Constance's reputation would be ruined. She'd never make a good marriage. Our entire social position would collapse. And for what? To acknowledge a child who's legally property. A child who has no rights, no standing, no future beyond what we choose to give her. She's my daughter. She's a slave. The law is very clear on that point. Her mother was a slave, therefore she's a slave, regardless of who her father is. You can't change that. You can't legitimize her. You can't give her your name or your inheritance. All you can do is create a scandal that will destroy your legitimate family. The Baron knew she was right. The laws of South Carolina were explicit, designed specifically to protect white men from the consequences of their actions. Children followed the condition of their mother. If the mother was enslaved, the child was enslaved, no matter who the father was. It was a system that allowed wealthy white men to rape their slaves with impunity, secure in the knowledge that any resulting children would simply increase their property holdings rather than their legal obligations. So we just keep her here as Constance's servant. What choice do we have? If we sell her, she might end up somewhere terrible. At least here we can ensure she's treated well. We can make sure she's safe. It was a rationalization, and they both knew it. But it was the only option that preserved their social standing and protected Constance's future. Very well, the Baron said finally. We'll say nothing, but I want your word that she'll be treated kindly. No beatings, no cruelty. She's to be given adequate food, clothing, and shelter. And when Constance marries, Eliza is to be freed. That's my condition. Margaret nodded slowly. Agreed. When Constance marries and leaves this house, we'll arrange for Eliza to be freed quietly with papers that give her a new identity. She can go north, start a new life where no one knows her history. But until then, she remains here, and no one can know the truth. Agreed. They descended to the dining room where Constance was already seated, chattering excitedly about her new servant. Eliza stood behind her chair, silent and still, her hands folded in front of her. When the Baron entered, she glanced at him briefly, and he saw something in her eyes that confirmed his worst fears. She knew. She knew exactly who he was, what he'd done, and what he was choosing to do now, and she was watching him, judging him, waiting to see if he would have the courage to acknowledge her, or the cowardice to pretend she didn't exist. He chose cowardice. Dinner was an awkward affair. Constance dominated the conversation, talking about her birthday party, her new dresses, her piano recital. Margaret picked at her food, her face pale and drawn. The Baron drank too much wine and said too little, and Eliza stood in the corner, a silent witness to the family's discomfort. Her presence a constant reminder of secrets that could never be spoken aloud. After dinner, Constance took Eliza upstairs to show her the room where she'd be sleeping. It was a small chamber next to Constance's bedroom, barely large enough for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small trunk for belongings, but it had a window that looked out onto the garden, and the bed had clean sheets and a warm quilt. Compared to the slave quarters where Eliza had been born, it was luxury. You'll sleep here, Constance said, and you'll wake me every morning at 7 o'clock. You'll help me dress, arrange my hair, and bring my breakfast. During the day, you'll attend to my correspondence, read to me, accompany me on walks, and help me with whatever I need. In the evening, you'll help me prepare for bed. Do you understand? Yes, miss. And you'll call me Miss Constance, not just Miss. I want you to remember who you belong to. Yes, Miss Constance. Constance smiled, pleased with herself. We're going to be great friends, Eliza. I can tell. You're so much prettier and smarter than the other servants. It's almost like having a sister. Eliza's face remained expressionless, but something flickered in her eyes. Yes, Miss Constance, almost like a sister. That night, alone in her small room, Eliza lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She was thinking about her mother, about the last conversation they'd had before the estate sale. Remember who you are, Sarah had said, gripping Eliza's hands tightly. Remember that you're more than what they say you are. Your father was a white man, a wealthy man. That makes you different whether they acknowledge it or not. Who was he, Mama? You've never told me. Sarah had hesitated, her face troubled. His name was Wilhelm Hargrove. He was young then, visiting the Brennan estate for a house party. He was handsome, charming, and I was foolish enough to believe him when he said he cared for me. But after that night he left, and I never saw him again. 3 months later, I realized I was carrying you. What happened then? Mrs. Brennan discovered my condition. She was furious. She said, I'd brought shame on the household, that I'd tempted a guest and caused scandal. She sold me to a trader who took me to Savannah. I gave birth to you in a slave pen with no doctor, no help, nothing but a dirty blanket and my own fear. And then Mrs. Brennan, the younger Mrs. Brennan, the school teacher, bought me. She was a kind woman, Eliza. She saw that I was educated, that I could read and write, and she thought I'd be useful in her household. She let me keep you, let me raise you, even let me teach you. For 14 years we had something close to a good life. But now she's gone, and we're back where we started. Will I ever see you again, Mama? Sarah had pulled her close, holding her tightly. I don't know, baby, I don't know. But I promise you this, I'll find a way to get you free. Somehow, someday, I'll find a way. Now, lying in the darkness of the Harrove mansion, Eliza wondered if her mother had known. Had Sarah somehow learned that Wilhelm Harrove was in Charleston, that he was wealthy and powerful, that he had a daughter the same age as Eliza? Had she arranged for Eliza to be sold at that particular auction house, knowing that the Baron might see her, might buy her, might bring her into his home? It seemed impossible. But then again, so did everything else about her situation. She thought about the Baron, about the way he'd looked at her when he finally recognized the resemblance. There had been shock in his eyes, and guilt, and fear, but no love, no recognition of her as his daughter, his child, his blood, just fear of scandal, fear of consequences, fear of losing what he'd built. She thought about Constance, her half-sister, who looked at her and saw a possession, a toy, a servant, who would never know that they shared a father, that they were bound by blood as well as law. And she thought about Margaret, the Baron's wife, who'd seen the truth immediately and chosen to bury it, who decided that protecting the family's reputation was more important than acknowledging Eliza's humanity. Eliza had learned long ago not to hope for things beyond her reach. Hope was a luxury slaves couldn't afford. It was better to accept your situation, do your work, and survive. Dreaming of freedom only made the chains heavier. But sometimes late at night, she allowed herself to imagine a different life. A life where her father acknowledged her, where her sister embraced her, where she was a person instead of property. A life where she could walk down the street without lowering her eyes, where she could choose her own clothes, her own work, her own future. It was a dangerous dream, and she, clears throat, knew it. But she couldn't quite let it go. The weeks passed slowly, settling into a routine that was both comfortable and suffocating. Eliza woke each morning at 6 o'clock, washed in cold water from the pitcher on her washstand, and dressed in one of the 3 gray dresses that had been provided for her. At 7, she woke Constance, helped her dress, arranged her hair in elaborate styles that took an hour to complete, and brought her breakfast on a silver tray. During the day, she attended to Constance's needs. She read aloud from romantic novels, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, The Scarlet Letter, while Constance embroidered or pretended to practice the piano. She wrote letters to Constance's friends, carefully copying the girl's dictation and adding flourishes that made the correspondence seem more elegant. She accompanied Constance on walks through the garden, carrying a parasol to protect her mistress's delicate skin from the sun. She helped her change clothes 3 or 4 times a day, depending on the social obligations of the afternoon and evening. It was exhausting work, but Eliza never complained. Complaining would only make things worse, and compared to the life she might have had, working in the fields or sold to a brothel or sent to one of the brutal plantations in the deep south, where slaves were worked to death in a few years. This was relatively comfortable. Constance treated her with a mixture of affection and casual cruelty that was typical of wealthy young women and their personal servants. One moment she would be chattering away, treating Eliza almost like a friend, confiding her dreams and fears and petty grievances. The next moment she would snap at her for some minor mistake, or pinch her arm when she was too slow, or threaten to have her whipped if she didn't perform her duties perfectly. Eliza learned to navigate these moods, to anticipate Constance's needs before they were spoken, to make herself indispensable. It was a survival skill, and she was good at it. The Baron avoided her as much as possible. He found excuses to leave the house early and return late. When he was home, he stayed in his study, poring over ledgers and correspondence, anything to avoid seeing that face that was so disturbingly like his own. But the house wasn't large enough to avoid her entirely. He would encounter her in hallways, on the stairs, in the garden. Each time she would lower her eyes and step aside, the picture of submissive obedience. But he always felt that she was watching him, judging him, waiting for something. Margaret watched the situation with cold calculation. She'd made her decision, and she would stick to it. Eliza was a problem to be managed, not a person to be acknowledged. As long as the girl behaved herself, as long as she didn't cause trouble or reveal the truth, Margaret would tolerate her presence. But if she stepped out of line, if she threatened the family's reputation in any way, Margaret would have her sold so quickly her head would spin. The other servants were curious about the new arrival. Thomas, the butler, treated her with distant politeness. He'd seen enough in his years of service to recognize that there was something unusual about the situation, but he was too professional to ask questions. Cook. A stout woman named Betsy, who'd been with the family for 20 years, was more openly suspicious. "That girl's too light-skinned for her own good," she muttered to Thomas one evening in the kitchen. "And did you see the way the mistress looked at her that first night, like she'd seen a ghost?" "Mark, my words, there's something strange about that child. It's not our place to speculate," Thomas replied firmly. "The Baron bought her, Miss Constance likes her, and that's all we need to know." But the speculation continued, whispered in corners and discussed in the slave quarters. Everyone could see the resemblance between Eliza and the Baron. Everyone could sense the tension in the household, and everyone wondered what secrets the Harrove family was hiding. 3 months after Eliza's arrival, on a hot June evening, when the air was thick with humidity and the smell of jasmine from the garden, the Baron received a letter. It was delivered by a private courier, not through the regular post, and it was addressed in a hand he didn't recognize. The paper was cheap, the ink slightly smudged, suggesting it had been written by someone unaccustomed to fine stationery. Inside was a single sheet with a brief message written in a neat, educated hand. "I know who she is. I know what you did. If you want to keep your secret, we need to talk. Come alone to the warehouse on Gadsden Street tomorrow night at midnight. Tell no one." There was no signature. The Baron's first instinct was to ignore it. It was probably a hoax. Someone trying to extort money based on rumors or speculation. But the timing was too precise. The letter had arrived exactly 3 months after he'd purchased Eliza, as if someone had been waiting to see what he would do with her, how he would treat her, whether he would acknowledge the truth. He considered telling Margaret, but decided against it. She would insist on involving the authorities, which would only create more attention. Better to handle this quietly, find out what the blackmailer wanted and resolve it with as little fuss as possible. He spent the next day in a state of nervous tension, unable to concentrate on his work, snapping at servants, drinking more than usual. Margaret noticed, of course, but she said nothing. She'd learned long ago that her husband had secrets, and that it was better not to ask too many questions. That night, he told Margaret he had a late business meeting and left the house at 11:30. The warehouse on Gadsden Street was in the commercial district near the docks. It was a large, dilapidated building that had once stored cotton but was now mostly abandoned, used occasionally by smugglers and others who needed a place to conduct business away from prying eyes. The Baron brought a pistol concealed in his coat and a substantial amount of cash, $500 in banknotes in case money was all the blackmailer wanted. He also brought a sense of dread that sat in his stomach like a stone. The warehouse was dark when he arrived, its windows broken, its doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges. He pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. The space was vast and empty, filled with shadows and the smell of mildew and old wood and something else, something organic and unpleasant that he couldn't quite identify. "Hello," he called out. His voice echoed in the darkness, bouncing off the high ceiling and the bare walls. For a long moment, there was no response. Then he heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere in the back of the warehouse. A figure emerged from behind a stack of crates, moving into a shaft of moonlight that fell through a broken window. It was a woman dressed in a dark cloak with the hood pulled up to hide her face. She moved with a kind of careful dignity, as if she were walking into a ballroom rather than an abandoned warehouse. "Baron Harrove," she said. Her voice was educated with a slight southern accent that suggested Georgia or the Corollas. "Thank you for coming. Who are you? What do you want?" The woman pushed back her hood and the Baron felt his world tilt on its axis. She was perhaps 40 years old with light brown skin and graying hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her face was lined with age and hardship, but there was a dignity in her bearing that suggested she'd once been someone of importance. And her eyes, dark, intelligent, haunted, were the same eyes that looked at him every day from Eliza's face. "My name is Sarah Brennan," she said. "I'm Eliza's mother, and I think we need to talk about what you've done." The Baron felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. "That's impossible. You're dead," the auction house said. "The auction house said what I paid them to say." Sarah interrupted. "I'm not dead, Baron. I've been living in Savannah for the past 14 years, working as a seamstress. I've saved every penny I could, hoping to buy my daughter's freedom someday. But I was never able to save enough. The price kept going up and I kept falling behind. And then I heard that she'd been sold." "How did you know?" "I have friends in Charleston, people who keep me informed about certain matters. When I learned that a girl matching Eliza's description had been purchased by Wilhelm Hargrove, I knew it had to be her, and I knew I had to act quickly." The Baron's mind was racing. "You arranged this. You arranged for her to be sold at that auction house, knowing I might see her." Sarah shook her head. "No, I had nothing to do with the estate sale. That was pure chance or fate, if you believe in such things, but when I learned where she'd gone, I saw an opportunity. You're her father, Baron. Whether you acknowledge it or not, you're her father, and I thought perhaps if you saw her, if you recognized her, you might do the right thing." "The right thing?" the Baron repeated bitterly. "And what would that be?" "Free her. Acknowledge her. Give her a chance at a real life." The Baron laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed in the empty warehouse. "You have no idea what you're asking. Even if I wanted to free her, which would raise all sorts of questions, she'd never be safe. She's a runaway slave, legally speaking. Anyone could claim her, sell her, do whatever they wanted with her. The only way she's protected is if she remains my property, then give her papers, manumission papers, make it legal. And how would I explain that? I just bought her 3 months ago. Why would I suddenly free her? People would ask questions, they'd start investigating. The truth would come out. My wife, my daughter, my entire social position, everything would be destroyed." Sarah stepped closer, her eyes blazing with an intensity that made the Baron take a step back. "The truth should come out. You raped me, Baron. I was 15 years old, and you raped me in the garden of my master's house while the other guests were drinking and laughing inside. You left me pregnant and alone. And when Mrs. Brennan discovered my condition, she sold me to a trader who took me to Savannah. I gave birth to Eliza in a slave pen with no doctor, no help, nothing but a dirty blanket and my own fear. I've spent 14 years trying to give her a better life, trying to protect her, trying to save enough money to buy her freedom. And now you've bought her like she's a piece of furniture, brought her into your house to serve your legitimate daughter, and you're telling me you can't free her because it might cause a scandal." The Baron felt a wave of shame so intense it was almost physical. He'd spent years trying not to think about that night, trying to convince himself it hadn't been as bad as he remembered, trying to bury the memory under layers of respectability and success. But hearing Sarah describe it in her own words, hearing the pain and anger in her voice made it impossible to hide from the truth. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know that's inadequate, but I am truly sorry. I was young and drunk and stupid, and I never considered the consequences of my actions. If I could go back and change what I did, I would. But you can't. So instead you need to make it right. Free Eliza. Give her a chance at a real life. Give her the future she deserves. I can't. Not without destroying my family. My wife, my daughter, they'd be ruined by the scandal. Constance would never make a good marriage. Margaret would be ostracized from society. Everything I've built would collapse. And what about my daughter? Sarah's voice rose, echoing in the empty space. Doesn't she deserve a family? Doesn't she deserve to be free? Or does she not matter because she's black? Because she's a slave? Because she's the product of your crime? They stood facing each other in the darkness. Two people separated by an unbridgeable gulf of race, class, and law. The Baron knew that Sarah was right. Eliza deserved freedom, deserved a life beyond servitude, deserved to be acknowledged as his daughter. But he also knew that freeing her would cost him everything he'd built. His reputation, his social standing, his daughter's future, all of it would be destroyed if the truth came out. I can't free her, he said finally, his voice heavy with defeat. But I can promise that she'll be treated well. She'll never be sold, never be punished, never be harmed. She'll have adequate food, clothing, shelter. She'll be educated, protected, and when my daughter marries, I'll arrange for Eliza to be freed quietly with papers that give her a new identity. She can go north, start a new life where no one knows her history. It's the best I can offer. Sarah's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks. That's not good enough. She's my daughter. I want her with me now. I want her free now. If you take her, she'll be hunted as a runaway. You'll both be caught and punished. Is that what you want? Is that better than what I'm offering? I want her to be free. I want her to have a life. I want her to be more than someone's property. Then let me do this my way. Give me time. I'll make sure she's safe. And when the moment is right, I'll give her freedom. You have my word. Sarah stared at him for a long moment, her face wet with tears, her body shaking with rage and grief. Then she shook her head slowly. Your word means nothing, Baron. You've already proven that. You gave me pretty words 28 years ago, and then you left me to face the consequences alone. Why should I trust you now? Because I'm her father. Because despite everything, despite all my failures and cowardice, I don't want to see her suffer. I know I can't make up for what I did to you, but I can try to protect her. Let me do that much at least. Sarah pulled her hood back up, hiding her face in shadow. I don't have any choice, do I? I can't fight you. I can't take her by force. I don't have the money to buy her, don't have the power to free her. All I can do is trust that you'll keep your promise. But know this, Baron, if you break your word, if you harm her, if you fail to free her when the time comes, I'll make sure everyone knows what you did. I'll tell your wife, your daughter, your friends, the newspapers. I'll stand on street corners and shout the truth if I have to. I'll destroy you the way you destroyed me. Remember that? She turned and walked toward the door, her footsteps echoing in the darkness. At the threshold, she paused and looked back at him. She knows. You know, Eliza knows who you are. I told her everything before the estate sale. I wanted her to understand where she came from, who her father was, what he'd done. So, when you look at her, when you see her serving your legitimate daughter, remember that she knows. She knows you're her father, and she knows you're choosing your reputation over her freedom. Live with that, Baron. Live with the knowledge that your own daughter sees you for exactly what you are, a coward. Then she was gone, disappearing into the night, leaving the Baron alone in the empty warehouse with his guilt and his shame and his impossible choices. He stood there for a long time, staring at the door through which Sarah had vanished. He was thinking about Eliza, about the way she looked at him with those dark, knowing eyes, his daughter, his child, his blood, and he was choosing to keep her enslaved, to maintain the fiction that she was just property, just another servant, just another piece of his vast holdings. He'd made a promise to Sarah, but he had no idea how to keep it. Freeing Eliza would require careful planning, perfect timing, and a plausible explanation that wouldn't raise suspicions. It might take years. And in the meantime, he would have to live with the knowledge that his own daughter was enslaved in his house, serving his legitimate daughter, treated as property rather than family. The irony was almost unbearable. He'd spent his entire life accumulating wealth and status, building a fortress of respectability around himself. And now that fortress had become a prison, trapping him in a situation of his own making, forcing him to choose between his reputation and his conscience. He chose his reputation. He'd been choosing it his whole life. He returned home and went directly to his study, where he poured himself a large glass of brandy and sat in the darkness thinking. The house was quiet, everyone asleep, but he could feel Eliza's presence, could imagine her lying awake in her small room, thinking about her mother, thinking about freedom, thinking about the father who bought her and refused to acknowledge her. He drank until the bottle was empty, until the guilt was numbed enough to bear. Then he stumbled upstairs to bed where Margaret lay sleeping, her face peaceful in the moonlight. She didn't wake when he climbed in beside her, didn't stir when he lay there staring at the ceiling, counting the hours until dawn. Upstairs in the small room next to Constance's bedroom, Eliza lay awake, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. She'd heard the Baron leave late at night, had watched from her window as he walked down the street toward the commercial district. She didn't know where he'd gone or why, but she could guess. Her mother had told her she would try to contact the Baron, would try to negotiate Eliza's freedom. Eliza had begged her not to, knowing it was futile, but Sarah had insisted. "I can't bear the thought of you living as a slave," Sarah had said, "especially not in the house of the man who fathered you." "I have to try, Eliza. Even if it's hopeless, I have to try." Now, lying in the darkness, Eliza wondered what had happened at that meeting. Had her mother pleaded for her freedom? Had the Baron refused? Had he promised something he had no intention of keeping? She would probably never know. Sarah couldn't risk contacting her directly, couldn't risk being seen near the Harrove house. They were separated now, perhaps forever, by the walls of slavery and the Baron's cowardice. Eliza had learned long ago not to hope for things beyond her reach. But sometimes late at night, she allowed herself to imagine a different ending to her story. An ending where her father acknowledged her, where her mother came for her, where she walked away from this house and never looked back. It was a dangerous dream, but she held on to it anyway, because it was all she had. The months passed slowly, summer giving way to fall, fall to winter. Charleston's weather cooled slightly, though it never became truly cold. The garden lost its flowers, the trees their leaves. The household settled into routines that felt both comfortable and suffocating. Constance grew more demanding as the weather worsened. She wanted constant attention, constant entertainment, constant reassurance that she was beautiful and beloved. Eliza provided all of it with patient efficiency, reading to her for hours, fanning her when she was too hot, warming her hands when she was cold, brushing her hair until it shone like gold. The Baron watched from a distance, tormented by guilt and indecision. He'd promised Sarah he would free Eliza when Constance married, but he still hadn't figured out how to do it without causing a scandal. He'd consulted with lawyers carefully, hypothetically, asking about the process of manumission and the legal requirements. The answers were discouraging. Freeing a slave in South Carolina required a petition to the state legislature, public notice in newspapers, testimony from white citizens vouching for the slave's good character, and proof that the freed person wouldn't become a burden on society. It was a lengthy, expensive process designed to discourage manumission, and it would inevitably draw attention to Eliza, which was exactly what the Baron wanted to avoid. He considered other options. He could sell her to a northern buyer who would then free her, but that would require finding a trustworthy intermediary, and there was always the risk that the buyer would simply keep her enslaved. He could send her north with forged free papers, but if she were caught, she'd be returned to slavery, and he'd face criminal charges for helping a runaway. He could arrange for her to die of some illness and then secretly transport her to freedom, but that would require elaborate planning and the cooperation of multiple people, any one of whom might betray him. Every option carried risks, and the Baron was not a man who liked taking risks, so he did nothing, telling himself he was waiting for the right opportunity, the perfect moment when he could act without consequences. But deep down he knew he was simply a coward, unwilling to sacrifice his comfort and reputation for the sake of a daughter he'd never acknowledged. In September of 1858, 18 months after Eliza's arrival, Constance announced that she was engaged. The young man was Harrison Caldwell, son of a prominent Charleston family, heir to a shipping fortune. He was 23 years old, handsome in a conventional way, with blonde hair and blue eyes, and the easy confidence of someone who'd never known hardship. The engagement was announced at a grand party at the Harrove mansion, attended by Charleston's elite. Constance wore a dress of pale pink silk with pearls at her throat and roses in her hair. She looked radiant, flushed with happiness and champagne. Harrison stood beside her, smiling and accepting congratulations, already planning the expansion of his father's shipping business that his marriage to the Harrove fortune would enable. The wedding was planned for the following spring, a grand affair that would be the social event of the season. Margaret threw herself into the preparations with manic energy, ordering dresses from Paris, flowers from New York, champagne from France. The wedding would cost a fortune, but it would also cement the Harrove family's position in Charleston society, and Constance announced casually over breakfast one morning that Eliza would be part of her doughy. "I'm taking her with me when I marry," she said, spreading jam on her toast. "Harrison has agreed. She'll be my personal servant in our new home." I couldn't possibly manage without her. The Baron, who'd been reading the newspaper, looked up sharply. Constance, I don't think that's a good idea. Why not? She's mine, isn't she? You gave her to me for my birthday. Yes, and I've grown quite attached to her. She knows exactly how I like things done. It would take years to train someone new. No, I've made up my mind. Eliza comes with me. The Baron tried to argue, suggesting gently that perhaps Constance should choose a different servant to take with her, someone older and more experienced. But Constance was adamant. She wanted Eliza. She'd grown attached to her in the way one might grow attached to a favorite pet. The idea of parting with her was unthinkable. The Baron tried a different approach. He offered to buy Constance a new servant, someone even better trained, even more skilled. He offered to buy her 2 servants, 3 servants, a whole household staff. But Constance refused. She didn't want someone new. She wanted Eliza. Margaret watched these negotiations with cold amusement. She knew exactly what her husband was trying to do and why, and she had no intention of helping him. As far as she was concerned, Eliza was a living reminder of Wilhelm's infidelity, a constant source of tension in the household. The sooner she was out of the house, the better. If that meant she would spend the rest of her life enslaved to Constance, so be it. Margaret had no sympathy for the girl. She was a bastard, a product of her husband's sin, and she deserved whatever fate befell her. The Baron realized he was trapped. He'd made a promise to Sarah that he would free Eliza when Constance married, but if Eliza became part of Constance's household, she would be beyond his control. He wouldn't be able to free her without his daughter's consent, and Constance would never agree to lose her favorite servant. He considered telling Constance the truth, revealing that Eliza was her half-sister, hoping that the revelation would shock her into freeing the girl. But he knew it wouldn't work. Constance was too much her mother's daughter, too concerned with social standing and reputation to let compassion override self-interest. She would be horrified by the scandal, certainly, but she would also be furious at her father for creating the situation, and she would probably take her anger out on Eliza, making the girl's life even more miserable. There was no good solution. Every path led to disaster. In November, the Baron received another letter from Sarah. This one was shorter, more desperate. You promised me you would free her when Constance married. I've heard that Eliza is to be part of the doughy, that she'll be going with your daughter to her new home. You're breaking your promise. If you don't act soon, I will. The threat was clear. Sarah was running out of patience. If the Baron didn't free Eliza, she would take matters into her own hands. Consequences be damned. The Baron knew he had to act, but he still didn't know how. The answer came from an unexpected source. In December, a yellow fever epidemic swept through Charleston. It was a mild outbreak compared to some years. Only 30 deaths compared to the hundreds that had died in the epidemic of 1854, but still deadly enough to cause panic. Wealthy families fled to the countryside. Businesses closed. The streets emptied as people barricaded themselves in their homes, burning tar and sulfur to ward off the disease. The Harrove family prepared to retreat to their plantation on the Ashley River, taking most of their servants with them. But 2 days before they were scheduled to leave, Eliza fell ill. It started with a headache, severe and throbbing, that made it difficult for her to stand. Then came the fever, burning hot, turning her skin clammy and her eyes glassy. Then the chills so intense that she shook uncontrollably, despite being wrapped in blankets. By evening, she was delirious, crying out for her mother, speaking in fragments that made no sense. The doctor was summoned. He examined her briefly, taking her pulse and looking at her eyes, then stepped back with a grim expression. Yellow fever, he said. No doubt about it. She needs to be quarantined immediately away from the rest of the household. Constance was distraught. But I need her. I can't leave without her. You'll have to, Miss Hargrove. Yellow fever is highly contagious. If you stay near her, you'll likely catch it yourself. And the mortality rate is quite high, perhaps 50% for someone her age. 50%. Constance's eyes filled with tears. You mean she might die? It's quite possible. Yes. Margaret was firm. We're leaving tomorrow morning as planned. Eliza will stay here in Charleston with someone to care for her. If she recovers, she can join us at the plantation. If she doesn't, she left the sentence unfinished. The Baron saw his opportunity. I'll arrange for her to be moved to a house I own on the outskirts of the city, he said quickly. Away from the main residence to prevent contagion. I'll hire a nurse to care for her. If she recovers, we'll bring her to the plantation. If not, well, we'll deal with that when the time comes. Margaret nodded, already turning away, already thinking about the packing that needed to be done. Constance wept dramatically, but allowed herself to be led away. The doctor gave instructions for Eliza's care and departed, eager to get home before dark. The Baron acted quickly. He arranged for Eliza to be moved that very night to a small house he owned on the edge of the city, a property he'd purchased years ago as an investment and rarely visited. He hired a nurse to care for her, a free woman of color named Ruth, who asked no questions and kept her own counsel. And he sent word to Sarah telling her where Eliza was and suggesting that if she wanted to act, now was the time. The message was simple. She's at the house on Lynch Street, number 47. The nurse will let you in. If you're going to do something, do it now while everyone thinks she's dying of yellow fever. This is your chance. Sarah arrived 3 days later. She came at night dressed in a servant's clothes and slipped into the house without being seen. Ruth let her in and then discreetly left them alone, going to sit on the porch where she could watch for anyone approaching. Eliza was still feverish, drifting in and out of consciousness, her skin hot and dry, her breathing shallow, but when she saw her mother, her eyes focused, and she reached out with a trembling hand. "Mama," she whispered. "You came." Sarah knelt beside the bed, taking Eliza's hand in both of hers, tears streaming down her face. "Of course I came, baby. Of course I came. How are you feeling?" "Terrible. Everything hurts." "Am I dying?" "No. You're going to be fine. The fever's breaking. You're going to be fine. Where am I?" "You're in a house on Lynch Street. The Baron moved you here when you got sick, and now we're leaving tonight. I have money enough to get us to Philadelphia. We'll go north, change our name, start over. You'll be free, Eliza. I promise you'll be free." Eliza wanted to believe her, but she'd learned not to trust in happy endings. "What if we're caught?" "Then we'll be caught, but at least we'll have tried." "I won't let you be a slave anymore, Eliza. I won't let you be owned by that man or his daughter. You deserve better. You deserve freedom." "But the Baron gave us this chance. I don't know why. Guilt maybe, or fear, or some last shred of conscience. But he told me where you were, and he's arranged for the nurse to look the other way. This is our opportunity, Eliza. We have to take it." They left that night. As soon as Eliza was strong enough to walk, Sarah had brought clothes for her, plain and dark, the kind a free servant might wear. She'd also brought forged free papers purchased at great expense from a man in Savannah who specialized in such documents. The papers identified Eliza as Elizabeth Freeman, free woman of color, born in Savannah, Georgia, 1843. It wasn't much protection. Forged papers were common and slave catchers were skilled at detecting them, but it was better than nothing. They slipped out of the house just after midnight when the streets were empty and dark. Ruth watched them go, then went inside and locked the door. In the morning, she would tell anyone who asked that Eliza had died during the night, that she'd wrapped the body in a sheet and arranged for it to be buried in a porpoise grave. It was a plausible story, and no one would question it. Yellow fever killed quickly, and the bodies of slaves were rarely given much ceremony. Sarah and Eliza walked through the dark streets of Charleston, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the night watch. They made their way to the docks where a ship was preparing to depart for Baltimore. Sarah had already purchased passage, paying extra for a cabin below deck where they wouldn't be seen. The ship left at dawn, slipping out of the harbor on the morning tide. Eliza stood on the deck, watching Charleston recede into the distance, watching the city where she'd been enslaved disappear behind them. She was thinking about the Baron, about the father who'd bought her Clear's throat, and then let her go. She didn't know if she would ever understand his motives, guilt, fear, love, cowardice, some mixture of all of them. But he'd given her this chance, and she was taking it. She was free, or at least she was running toward freedom, which was the closest she'd ever come. The Baron discovered Eliza's disappearance 2 days later when Ruth sent him a message saying the girl had recovered enough to travel, but had left with a woman claiming to be her aunt. He knew immediately what had happened. Sarah had taken Eliza, just as she'd threatened to do. His first instinct was to report them as runaways, to send slave catchers after them, to use every resource at his disposal to bring Eliza back. The law was on his side. She was his property, legally purchased, and Sarah had stolen her. He could have them both arrested, punished, returned to slavery, but then he stopped himself. What would that accomplish? If Eliza were caught and returned, she would be punished, possibly sold to someone far worse than him, and Sarah would make good on her threat to expose his secret, destroying his family in the process. He could let them go. He could tell Constance that Eliza had died of yellow fever, which was plausible enough that no one would question it. He could mourn publicly and privately feel relieved that the problem had solved itself. Sarah and Eliza would disappear into the north and he would never have to face his guilt again. It was the coward's choice, but the Baron had been a coward all along. He wrote a brief letter to Ruth instructing her to tell anyone who asked that Eliza had succumbed to yellow fever and been buried in a porpoise grave. He paid Ruth generously for her silence, $100, more money than she'd see in a year of work. And then he returned to the plantation and told his family the sad news. Constance wept dramatically. She'd lost her favorite servant, her companion, her friend. For weeks, she was inconsolable, refusing to eat, refusing to leave her room, refusing to be comforted. Margaret offered perfunctory condolences, but seemed secretly pleased. The girl had been a source of tension in the household, and now she was gone. Problem solved. The Baron said nothing, retreating to his study with a bottle of brandy and his memories. He never saw Eliza again. He never knew if she and Sarah made it safely to Philadelphia, or if they were caught and returned to slavery, or if they died somewhere along the way. He told himself it didn't matter, that he'd done what he could, that he'd given them a chance at freedom, even if it meant breaking the law and risking his own reputation. But late at night when he couldn't sleep, he would think about the girl with his eyes and his nose and his bloodline, the daughter he'd bought and lost, the living proof of his sins. And he would wonder if she ever thought about him, if she hated him, if she understood that he'd tried in his own inadequate way to make things right. He would never know. The wedding took place in April 1859, a grand affair attended by Charleston's elite. Constance looked beautiful in her white silk gown, though there was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She missed Eliza, missed having someone her own age to confide in, missed the companionship she'd taken for granted. But she married Harrison Caldwell, moved into a grand house on Meeting Street, and began the life of a wealthy Charleston matron. Margaret died 3 years later of pneumonia. She was 43 years old, still beautiful, still cold, still keeping secrets. The Baron remarried within a year, a widow from Savannah named Catherine Thornton, and had no more children. He lived to see the Civil War destroy the world he'd known, watched his fortune evaporate as the Confederacy collapsed, and died in 1869. A broken man in a broken South. His last words, whispered to the priest who attended his deathbed, were, "Tell her I'm sorry. Tell Eliza I'm sorry." The priest, who had no idea who Eliza was, nodded and murmured prayers for the dying. The Baron closed his eyes and slipped away, taking his secrets with him. Constance and Harrison had 4 children. They lost everything in the war but rebuilt their lives, moving to Atlanta and starting a new business. Constance never spoke of Eliza, the servant girl who died of yellow fever so long ago. If she ever suspected the truth about the girl's identity, she never said so. Some secrets were too dangerous to acknowledge, even in memory. And Eliza, history is silent on what became of her. There are no records of a Sarah and Eliza Brennan arriving in Philadelphia in 1858, no census records, no city directories, no newspaper mentions. They vanished completely, which was probably intentional. Runaway slaves who wanted to stay free learned to erase their pasts, to adopt new names and new identities, to become invisible. But there is one tantalizing clue discovered by a historian researching free black communities in Philadelphia in the 1860s. In the 1870 census, there's an entry for a dressmaker named Elizabeth Freeman, described as a mulatto woman operating a successful shop on Chestnut Street. The entry notes that she'd arrived in the city before the war and had built a reputation for excellent work and fair prices. She lived with an older woman named Sarah Freeman, described as her mother. There's no mention of their origins, no indication of where they came from or how they'd learned their trade. But the timing fits, and the profession, dressmaking, was exactly the trade Sarah Brennan had practiced in Savannah. And the name Elizabeth Freeman could easily have been derived from Eliza, with Freeman chosen for its obvious symbolism. If Elizabeth Freeman was indeed Eliza Harrove, then she lived to see slavery abolished, lived to see her people freed, lived to build a life on her own terms. She would have been in her late 20s when the war ended, young enough to start over, old enough to appreciate what freedom meant. She never married, according to the census records. She lived with her mother until Sarah's death in 1875, and then alone running her shop and supporting herself through her own labor. She died in 1891 at the age of 48 of tuberculosis. She was buried in Eden Cemetery in a grave marked with a simple stone that read, Elizabeth Freeman, 1843-1891, free at last. Whether she ever thought about the Baron, about the father who'd bought her and then let her go, we'll never know. Whether she forgave him or hated him or simply forgot him is lost to history. What we do know is this: she survived, she escaped. She built a life beyond slavery, beyond the Harrove mansion, beyond the chains that had bound her. And perhaps that's the only ending that matters. The Harrove mansion on Trad Street still stands, though it's been converted into a museum. Tourists walk through the elegant rooms, admiring the period furniture and the portraits on the walls. One portrait hanging in the study shows Baron Wilhelm Harrove in his prime, a handsome man with dark eyes, a straight nose, and a confident smile. If you look closely at that portrait, and if you have a good imagination, you might see a resemblance to a girl who once stood in that same room, barefoot and shivering, waiting to learn her fate. A girl who looked like the Baron, who carried his blood, who was his daughter in every way that mattered except the only way that counted under the law. The museum guides don't mention her. There's no plaque, no explanation, no acknowledgement that she ever existed. The official history of the Harrove family makes no mention of a slave girl named Eliza, who served Constance Harrove briefly before dying of yellow fever in 1858. It's as if she never existed, as if her life left no mark on the world. But if you stand in that study long enough, if you let yourself feel the weight of history pressing down on you, you might sense her presence. You might imagine her standing in the corner, watching, waiting, judging. You might hear the whisper of her voice, asking the question that haunts every slave narrative, every story of injustice and cruelty and families torn apart. How could you? And you might wonder, as the Baron wondered in his final years, whether some debts can ever truly be repaid, whether saying, "I'm sorry," is enough, whether giving someone a chance at freedom absolves you of the crime of enslaving them in the first place. The answer, of course, is no. Some sins are too great to be forgiven, some wounds too deep to heal. The Baron bought his own daughter at auction, kept her enslaved in his house, and let her serve his legitimate daughter for 18 months before finally, reluctantly giving her a chance to escape. That's not redemption. That's just a slightly less terrible ending to a terrible story. But it's the ending we have, and perhaps in the end that's all history can offer us. Not justice, not redemption, not even understanding. Just the facts laid bare and the question of what we would have done in their place. What do you think of this story? Do you believe the Baron did enough to make amends for his crime? Do you think Eliza and Sarah made it to freedom, or were they caught and returned to slavery? Leave your comment below if you enjoyed this dark tale from American history and want more stories like this. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves historical mysteries. See you in the next. 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 See you in the next.